one of the things that you all were most interested in was avoiding spin, understandably given your jobs. And obviously, in order to avoid spin, you first need to be able to identify it, and that is where Dr. Fisher comes in. She is a researcher at the University of Canberra in Australia. So first off, I want to thank her for waking up very, very early to speak to us today. It is tomorrow morning for her. And Dr. Fisher, I want to let you have the floor. Feel free to introduce yourself and tell us about how to identify all the different kind of categories that you see that are most commonly used by politicians.
Okay, look, thank you so much. I will share my screen shortly because I've got some slides which I'm happy to share, afterwards. Look, thanks for the invitation. That was unexpected and a lovely surprise. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose lands Canberra is situated, and I pay my respects to those elders past and present, and I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to any traditional owners on the lands where you all are this afternoon, your time, or yesterday, your time. Okay, so let me share my screen. I think the way you found me was through a piece that I did for The Conversation in Australia, and it was done in the lead up to the 2019 federal election here, and it was beautifully titled "The Vomit Principle, the Dead Bat, the Freeze, How Political Spin Doctors' Tactics Aim to Shape the News." I wrote it as an explainer, as a bit of a glossary of spin terms for the public to help them decipher what was going on, not just during the election, but generally speaking in political communication. And interestingly, it ended up being one of the most read, or the top 50 read articles in the last 10 years of The Conversation, and was put into a book. And I don't say that to brag about it. I say that because it's really fascinating to me that there is this ongoing interest from the public and this need to understand, how does this all work? What are the techniques being used? And so that's kind of interesting. So it does go through a range of tactics. I just want to also stress, it's by no means an exhaustive list. And there's some, I want to actually freshen it up. There's a couple that I'd like to add to that as well at the end. So the tactics that I talk about here today and that are in this article, they come from my own scholarship, the scholarship of others, but also my own personal experience. So just so you know, I was a spin doctor in another life. Before I was a journalist as well. I've worked on both sides of the fence, so to speak. And in fact, my PhD examines the transition from journalism to being a spin doctor and going back again, and all of the ethical conflicts around that. And so this topic is both personally interesting to me as well as, professionally, scholarly interest as well. So some of the tactics that I talk about here are from my own research as well. But I think before we get on to that list, I would really like to just, given what's happening in the Ukraine, et cetera, at the moment, I just want to, one of the things with these terms like spin, fake news, propaganda, they're definitionally really problematic, and they get bandied around really easily, and they start to mean nothing. And I guess I just want to just really make a bit of a distinction here and kind of put spin in some context, some historical context as well. So at the moment, obviously, what's going on at the moment in the Ukraine, we actually don't get to see a lot of the propaganda because we censor a lot of it in the West. But what we do get to see, it's very clear that there is, extraordinary propaganda being fed to the Russians, etc., about what's happening there. But propaganda, is the root of spin. Spin comes from a history of propaganda, but propaganda has its own very specific elements. That it is a deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, direct behaviour to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. I've got a list of references at the back here as well, so if you want to look later any of this up, you can. Tends to have three key elements, rhetoric, myth and symbolism. There's some classic examples there. I did just put up a screenshot there of a recent interview with that Russian journalist who was spewing the Russian lines. Quite interesting example there. But importantly, it is very much about true propaganda. If we use that term accurately, true propaganda must also follow some basic rules. It reinforces prejudices, particularly racism. It advocates that action can bring change and the positive future, the future that's sought. Positive from, well, in this case, Russia's perspective, not the Ukraine's. Give an impression of speaking some kind of common sense truth. Tends to treat the audience as quite passive and denies them information as well. And then this overuse of sort of symbolic and visual and rhetorical devices. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there that, when we come to use these terms like spin, which is very poorly defined, fake news, very poorly defined, propaganda, that we just be a bit careful about the words that we use. I know your previous speaker was talking about the use of words. I mean, it really is important because if we're not specific, they do end up meaning nothing. Okay, so then let's look at spin. I mean, as I say, historically, spin, the term spin, these kind of public relations and political public relations tactics did evolve, from propaganda. And of course, propaganda after the World Wars, became incredibly dirty word. Prior to that, you were a propagandist. I mean, instead of a public relations practitioner, you were, a propagandist. But the whole industry needed a makeover. They gave themselves a facelift. They spun it and ended up changing the name to public relations. These techniques around putting a gloss on something, trying to accentuate the positive, minimize the negative, all of these tactics that were used, in a commercial realm, then started, to then increasingly be used in day-to-day politics. And the term, over time became, with the growth of public relations professionals, increasingly and infiltrating into the public sphere and into politics, other democratic spaces. Then the word kind of spin started to emerge. And the word spin, as you probably all know, emerged in the sort of the 1980s in the US. Exactly when, it's hard to pinpoint. Some say it was during a presidential debate between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. The advisors were in the back room, trying to reinforce the key messages of that speech, and that they call that spinning. So that's kind of, one version of the heritage. There are others. Look, this isn't new. It's as old as Aristotle. It's the basis of political rhetoric, is trying to, like I say, put a gloss on achievements and while tarnishing your opponent. I mean, that's just, the art of political rhetoric. One definition here, spinning is when a person telling a story emphasises certain facts and links them together in ways that play to their advantage, while at the same time downplaying or ignoring inconvenient facts. So it's a very selective process. The basic story being told is distorted, but the facts are not put together so as to tell a false story, which would be a lie. Now, I've put this particular quote here from Mearsheimer because it is really important, and we are in this kind of post-truth, digital era where lying, has become a real feature of the landscape. And so spin itself was, developed in the mass media era, in the age of TV and newspapers, and it evolved in a very specific kind of environment where you guys had all the control. The gatekeepers had all the control, and the only control the politicians had was the information they released to you. You then had control on how it was presented. And, you know, it's about journalist-source relations, really. There's a real tension there. And about, you know, wrestling that control. But so spin, that's changed now in the social media era. You know, politicians have regained a lot of control. You know, they don't need you like they used to. They can publish themselves to their own audiences, as we, you know, have seen, and Trump is a master of it on Twitter. But so a lot of these spin techniques, you know, were born in a specific era of where politicians had much less control than they do now about how their image was portrayed, how their comments were portrayed. You know, they could give a whole speech. You chose the 10-second grab. You know, you chose what to leave in, what to leave out, how they looked, who to put up against them, you know, or the counter argument, etc. So this is what spin is really about. I put Kellyanne Conway there as a bit of tongue-in-cheek. I mean, what she would call, you know, alternative facts. The thing, though, being in this case was, it wasn't just spin. I mean, it was a lie. You know, I mean, it was clear, and even the evidence they used made it look ridiculous. But there is also a kernel of truth to what she says there. That there are alternative facts sometimes, as in, you know, just there are different elements of truth. Truth is selective, and even in journalism it's selective, which is something I'm very happy to talk to you about. And in fact, a background in journalism is fabulous training to be a spin doctor. Finding the strongest angle for a story, being selective in who you interview, the grabs you use, the headlines, etc. You know, it's spin with balance. I say that having been on both sides of the fence, so, you know, you might make you angry me saying that, but happy to debate it with you afterwards. Okay. So like I say, so these tactics that I'm now going to get into really are born of this mass media age, where there's real tension between politicians and journalists, because particularly this gatekeeping function that you had, which you don't really have as much anymore. This is actually a really great book, and it's still relevant. It was written by a former minister here in a former Labor government, and he was just appalled by the state of political communication, state of political discourse in Australia. And he wrote this book, and again, this might really annoy you, but he says, what is now universally derided as spin, is in fact a whole range of techniques that have evolved among politicians, and I should put here, and their spin doctors, in response to managing media dynamics. In essence, these techniques, though highly manipulative, are inherently defensive. So they're sort of politicians protecting themselves. The more the media set out to trap politicians in order to generate entertaining content, the more politicians have to resort to dubious artifice to do their jobs. Interesting. You know, it is this struggle, this negotiation of control, you know, of controlling the message and the presentation of that message. And so a lot of the techniques that you see here, you can really see it's about them trying to maintain some kind of control over the release of information to you, because once it got to you, they had no control over the way it was presented. So the classic, and you'll know a lot of these, so I don't want to teach anyone how to suck eggs, but, you know, these are some of the classics, and, you know, the leak, of course, very strategic, deliberate, a really good way to control the release of information to a favoured journalist, or you know, about a particular issue, or they've got some kind of agenda, they're trying to undermine somebody in their party, or whatever it is that they're trying to do. The problem with this in particular, it's got worse and worse in Australia, is that once upon a time you leaked and then they did what they want with it, and they may have, you know, gone to get the other side of the story as well. But now it's kind of like, you know, you get the leak in exchange for no scrutiny, so that they get a really, you know, a clean first hit without any kind of alternative perspective, and that's becoming, I think, a real problem in Australian political journalism. This really very manipulative. You know, you can have the story first, but you're not allowed to get, you know, alternative comment before you publish. So that's really a really bad trend here. The freeze, you know, punishing journalists for negative reporting, you know, and you see that in America all the time, you know, particularly under Trump, I should say. Trump was famous for banning journalists from press conferences. The spray, he was a trump at that. He was a master at that too. Bullying and intimidation, trying to punish journalists for negative coverage. And I guess the term fake news, the way he levelled that at the news media there, calling them the enemy of the people, is a good example of that. The drip, so the act of keeping favoured journalists on a drip of exclusive information. I assume under Trump that was Fox. I don't know who it is under Biden, whether that happens. I'm sure it does. I'm not that familiar with who's on the inside there in America at the moment. Staying on message, on the face of it, doesn't look like a very sinister type of covert spin tactic. It becomes problematic when the desire to stay on message and the constant repetition of that message, staying on message, becomes a form of obfuscation. That's when staying on message is a real problem. Can I say, I didn't talk about this, I've called this covert spin tactics. Why? There was a great analysis of spin in the 1980s, the analysis of the spin in the UK of the Blair government and the Thatcher government by a guy called Professor Ivor Gaber, who's a seminal kind of scholar in this area. And he did this analysis, and some of these are from his analysis. And he divided spin tactics into two areas. Sort of overt, what are called above the line spin tactics, which are completely harmless, putting out a press release, holding a press conference, staging a picture opportunity, completely normal. No one would have a problem with that. And then he had these other ones, covert spin tactics, which are sort of below the line, below the belt, really. And these are the more malign, Machiavellian spin tactics, that spin doctors are known for. So sorry, I didn't explain that a bit earlier, what that title on that slide was about. Okay, so then pivoting, that is a classic. Politicians do it all the time. They pivot, they're in an interview, they don't like the question they've been asked, so they pivot the discussion in another direction so that they can talk about the thing they want to talk about and stay on comfortable ground. They get training in that and they're masterful at it. The vomit principle, the title of the article. I don't know if this is a thing in America, but here it hadn't been written about much. It is now, after I wrote this article, but it's a rule of thumb. You talk about it in political offices here all the time. Basically, it's not until you feel like vomiting, that you're nauseous because you said something so many times. You've said the message so many times. And it's not until you kind of feel sick at saying it again that you know that it's only just starting to cut through with the public imagination, that you just, so it's called the vomit principle. If you're not feeling sick yet, you haven't said it enough, I suspect Make America Great Again is one of those examples. I don't know. It's sort of, it was nauseating for us here listening to it. I don't know what it was like for you there. Playing a dead bat, just don't get back to the media. You put in a call, I'm sure it's happened to all of you, they don't return your call. Well, they just, don't respond. Sometimes that's the best response, or give a very minimal response. And it's basically trying to kill the story by just letting it, starving it of oxygen, basically. The truth, but not the whole truth. This is about, being very selective about what one reveals and sharing only the most beneficial information, or sharing only the least damaging information. So, for instance, and being very selective about it. So if you make a media inquiry, and whatever that might be, you're seeking information on something in particular. As a media advisor, as a spin doctor, you answer that specifically. You don't give them any less, any more. It's very, very, very narrow. So it's selective truth. And like I say, journalism is selective truth as well. And like I say, good training for public relations. Throwing out the bodies, taking out the garbage. This is a classic in scholarship and in mythology, really. It's about using the cover of a major event to get rid of bad news. And sort of, the classic example of that was during the 9/11 attacks, that in the UK, a junior press secretary for Blair said, hey, now's a good time to, get rid of bad news, it'll get buried today. And that was about a council's expense scandal. Other times, Christmas Eve, 10 o'clock on a Friday night, they pick these times where people aren't paying attention as well, to sneak out bad information. And so you can't be accused of having concealed it. You have released the information, just no one paid any attention. Get rid of it now. This is a tactic that was one of my interviewees talked about in my research, was that, sometimes issues just go on and on. They bleed and bleed and bleed, and you've got to stop it from bleeding. And he says, excuse the swearing here, his quote was, it's a truism in politics. If you've got to eat a shit sandwich, you've got to eat it straight away. The advice was always, get rid of it now, go and deal with it now. So whatever it might be, maybe it is an expensive scandal. Don't let it just drip out and leak out. Just get it all and dump it out there, and get it over with in one go. Fire breaking. This is different to throwing out the bodies or taking out the garbage. Fire breaking is actually, instead of there being actually something in the real world happening that diverts people's attention, fire breaking is actually staging something to divert people's attention. Wag the dog is probably the most cynical example of that, to the US president fabricating a war to, distract from a sex scandal. But that's a fairly colourful example of what fire breaking is. There's a similar strategy that's been talked about a little bit, and particularly in the UK, called the dead cat bounce strategy. I don't know if you're aware of that. I've added that here. That wasn't in my original article, where you suddenly introduce some kind of outlandish claim to divert attention and scrutiny. Basically being, if someone dropped a dead cat onto the table, everyone would go, what? So it's completely out of the blue, completely random, and designed specifically to divert attention. Kite flying, testing the waters, trying to get an idea out there. Maybe it's a policy idea or something that you might leak it, for instance, and just test the waters, see what the reaction is. People do it on social media a lot. Use social media now as a kite flying kind of vehicle to test ideas. If there's a backlash, they don't go ahead with it. If it resonates well, then they might pursue it. Keeping out of the media, being a small target, that is a very, very commonly used tactic in Australia. At the moment, our Labor opposition is being a very small target, and there's good reason. In some instances, it cops a lot of criticism because you're not standing up and really flying a flag, but it does also reduce the surface area of attack. And in some instances, not necessarily at the moment, but there are times, if your opposition is doing a great job of harming themselves, well, just let them keep doing it. Keep out of the media and just let them kind of hang themselves. So being a small target sometimes is a really good strategy. Or if you're a poor performer, just keep out of the media. Just keep your head down, don't open yourself up for attack unnecessarily. Flying under the radar, again, that's just getting on with your job and just not publicising it. And that can happen quite a lot, particularly on sensitive issues, sensitive policy issues. They don't want to, if they're divisive, they don't want to draw attention to them, so they just, don't seek publicity at all. Dishing the dirt, as old as time, suddenly old claims emerge, before an election, or trying to smear someone's reputation. It can come from inside or outside the party, depending on the agenda, trying to destroy someone's career. I guess Clinton's extramarital affairs is an example of that. Justin Trudeau, trawling social media, that old brown face photo of his, from a fancy dress party, that's embarrassing. So, there's lots of examples of this everywhere, and people work full-time in dirt units, either inside, political parties or external public, privately funded dirt units. Dog whistling, really damaging. I mean, it's a really distressing tactic, I think. Really trying to, using specific subtle language and messages, symbols, etc., to target a particular section of the community. They're often racist. Dog whistles. I mean, I think Trump used to do this really well. Really well. He used to use this a lot. I mean, he was effective doing it. It's a terrible tactic. Particularly in relation to sort of demonising, criminalising Mexicans, about Mexican border control. I think there's quite a lot of dog whistling around that. Also with Obama, he used to always say, Barack Hussein Obama, again, trying to play on people's fears, xenophobia, fears of Muslims, etc. His failure to condemn white supremacy, again, just sending little subtle messages, Proud Boys, all that kind of stuff. He was the master at dog whistling. We also saw just recently, I think, in a swimming in a race, was it last night? There's a Ukrainian one, and there was a Russian, I think came second, and the Russian on his white singlet had a white Z, just quietly sitting there, didn't say anything, but that's a symbol of Russia and the Russian invasion, and basically him saying without saying anything, I support the invasion of Ukraine. So again, a dog whistle. And wedging, lastly here, this tactic involves, raising an issue that's popular in the electorate, but very sensitive to the party you're opposing. So you try to wedge them on something to sow division in the party about that, and really make it difficult for them to manoeuvre. It happens a lot here in Australia over issues, we had it for a long time over gay marriage, believe it or not. I think in the US, I imagine this happens a lot around gun reform, abortion, race issues. Okay, so that's that list that was in that article.
Dr. Fisher, I wonder if I could ask, when you made the transition from journalism to spin, was there anything that shocked you, or anything that you were like, oh wow, that's what I fell for the most?
Well, actually, having worked on both sides, was when I went back to journalism, it was really fabulous, because I just really understood all the tactics. And so if I rang a minister's office, spoke to their press secretary or their media advisor and wanted some information, and they'd give me some excuse why they couldn't give it to me. And I'd say, well, no, I understand how the process works. I understand what cabinet and confidence means. I understand the legislative process, and so I actually understood all of the internal machinations, the flow of power, the hierarchy in the public service, all of that stuff. So I could call their bluff, basically, and say, well, that's just not true, and so I didn't fall for this stuff after I'd been on the other side, because I understood it. But some of it also I understood. So some of it I had sympathy for. And I guess this is kind of, in a way, I can go back to, that quote from that former minister about how it is a kind of a defensive technique, because, governments, I don't know what it's like in America, it's very partisan there, you're very polarised. It's not like that so much here in Australia. And, governments do good, but a lot of, most political reporting is negative. And governments get really annoyed by the fact that the good work that they do never gets talked about. Or they do something and only the negative is portrayed. A lot of news media, and particularly at the moment, with social media, with digital disruption, and even in Australia, news is becoming more polarised slowly, and so they really do pursue particular partisan lines, and so the coverage is becoming less and less balanced, and that is really annoying. And there are journalists you just didn't trust, and so why would I give them information? that I think they're going to misuse. So if they did come to me with an inquiry, I would give them the absolute bare minimum that they asked for. I wouldn't give them a word more, because I knew that they weren't going to be fair to me. And this was actually really dominant theme in the research, and all of the people I interviewed for my PhD were all journalists who had been media advisors and went back to journalism. All of them respected. And they completely understood this, and that they really advocated actually doing, that it was really beneficial to their journalism, having spent time on the other side. It is about trust. That relationship is so important. And what it really showed was that the worse the relationship between the journalist and the politician, the less information you are going to get, okay? And that we're mutually responsible for that. So if you're fair, you're balanced, you give them a right of reply, you don't call them at 10 o'clock on a Friday night for comments, you actually give them, plenty of time to actually give you a proper response, all of that stuff. But no one expects, for there to be no critique. That's not what journalism is. Politicians understand that. They just want it to be fair. So I understood not all of these tactics, but I did understand that defensive nature, that sometimes the news media treats you really poorly. But there's, and the only control you have is on your release of information to them and how you release it to them. So I think that was one of the big messages, I guess, for me out of my PhD, my research, is really understanding, that when you lose that trusted relationship, if you can't be respected and relied upon to be fair, well, then why should you expect them to be open with you, full candor, full disclosure? It's just not going to happen.
If you're prepping a politician, a candidate, how much time is actually spent in terms of media training, in terms of, teaching them, the various tactics that they might want to take on specific issues?
Hey, look, it's a really good question. My answer isn't going to be very satisfactory. I was really lucky. I had the minister that I worked for. She went on to become the Premier of Queensland, actually. She was a really good performer. And she was naturally savvy, sensible, and she didn't need a lot of training. There were certain interviews, etc., that, if I thought it was going to, live TV on our, perhaps our most critical current affairs television program or whatever, we'd rehearse possible questions and answers, etc., things like that. But I was lucky. I didn't have to do a lot of stuff with her. I would put up talking points and stuff, ideas for her, and she would just work on them herself, in the 5 minutes in the car or whatever. I mean, they actually don't have a lot of time. If you're a busy minister, you actually don't have a lot of time to do this stuff. You are literally doing it in the car. All those, I used to love the West Wing because it's true. You just, the times you get to talk to them, like in the elevator or, walking down the corridor talking to them, because there's just no time. So it depends. I think if you're a poor performer, I knew people who worked for other ministers who were really, really bad media performers, and they spent a lot of time with them and actually tried to keep them out of the media as much as possible. So I think it really does depend on the performance capability of the minister or of the politician.
Mm-hmm. Several of the tactics are sort of in the flying under the radar area, and how do you get around that as a journalist?
Yeah, hard. You have to build trust. I think it is about relationships and personal relationships, and those people who work really hard. I think it really comes down in the end to personal relationships and to see whether or not you can build up the trust that you are going to perform ethically and fairly, and then they may well let you into some of the stuff that they're doing. But other than that, I don't really see an answer. But it really is all about relationships.
I'm so interested in this list because we've seen so many stories about Trump using dog whistles, but certainly pretty much every other tactic in there we've also seen. Why do you think that do you think that it's appropriate for journalists even in an analysis, to call out the tactics that are being used, and how would that happen? Or does it make more sense to just be aware of them and find the information in some other ways?
So it depends. I mean, you have to think about your audience. I mean, I think there is a desire. That the spin, the fact that spin there are TV shows about it, there are sitcoms about it, because people are interested, in it, and it's an important part of, the political landscape, the political discourse, how it's shaped. I mean, it's a democratic issue, and so I think it is important to talk about it. I think the thing that journalists have to be really careful of, and the thing that we're criticised, in Australia for all the time, is that, spending too much time on this tactical stuff and not enough time talking about what actually matters to people and the policies and the things that are going on. So I think it has to be a balance. I think it's fine for there to be analysis pieces about this stuff, but don't spend too much time on it, because it just increases cynicism, which is important as well. It's a balance, there is this relationship between media reporting, trust in media, trust in politicians, downward spiral. The more cynical they are, the more cynical the public becomes, et cetera, et cetera. It's really important that we don't get too caught up in it. It needs to be out there. People need to be able to educate themselves about it, and you need to know about it. But I wouldn't spend too much time reporting on it. I think you've got to report on the policy, on the stuff that affects people's lives. There's not enough of it.
Candace.
Hi. I was going to ask, what you think the influence of the internet is on kind of spin now. I don't know if this is an accurate assessment, but it seems to me that at times, kind of what you were saying with the gatekeepers and how that's journalists and politicians, how that responsibility and power has changed. It seems like regular people in some ways can be agents of spin tactics, and I'm curious if you found that to be the case, and if so, how do you think that influences our jobs essentially in doing our jobs as journalists?
I think I heard most of what you said, but it's basically about the shifting power balance between journalists and politicians in the social media era. Is that right?
Yeah.
And how that's shaped tactics?
Yes, and also about how average citizens now can kind of are contributing to the spin, and how to deal with that. Yeah.
So, absolutely. It's completely, I'm just going to move, because there are two things that I wanted to talk about, actually, about two, I think, new tactics, which are, there's lots of them, but these are two that I want to talk about a little bit. But I'll also talk more broadly. So what has absolutely happened? The internet has turned, that relationship on its head. And, like I say, in the mass media era, you guys are the gatekeepers, you had ultimate control, Politicians, the only control they've had is about the type of information they give to you. You then had total control on the way it was presented, and hence spin, and then trying to manipulate as much as possible. In the digital era, the gate's open. They can, call it disintermediation. They publish, they bypass the news media. They go straight to their publics on social media and elsewhere. They don't need you like they used to. And that's a fact that there has been a disempowering. It's been a disruption to your power, to your gatekeeper. There are new gatekeepers. Everyone's a gatekeeper on there now, effectively. And so that has been really disruptive, and I think that is a real problem. What that means is, though, of course, that has completely influenced the spin tactics that they use. I might jump to the second one first, and it is to do with lying that I really want to talk about as well. So because they can go, you don't filter them as much anymore. They put the claim out there. It's very hard to scrutinise it. The horse has bolted. Your job is catch up a lot of the time now, particularly with Trump. It was horrendous. And so you ended up amplifying his messages rather than kind of filtering them. So you were part of his scheme and he loved it. Okay, and it's really hard. It's happening everywhere. But it's about logic. There's stuff called media logics. In the mass media era, same TV, the logic of television is pictures and the 10-second soundbite, right? And so TV was everything. It was the dominant form. It was in everyone's lounge room, and that's how you got your message across, right? And so politicians, everyone, and their media advisors adopted the logic of television, and so they completely crafted the way they spoke, the way they delivered their messages, influenced the way they thought about policy. It was like, how are we going to present this on TV? So they adopted the logic of television, okay, to get the message across and to meet the needs of the mass media. Well, the same thing is happening now. It's called social media logic. And each of these platforms have, Twitter has its own logic, Instagram has its own logic. Instagram's all about pictures, Twitter's all about, words effectively, and sharing links. And it was originally just limited characters, etc. Facebook, has its own logic and audience as well. But the key logic around social media is its network logic, its viral logic, okay? And so they know how to take advantage of that. They know that controversial, negative claims spread faster than positive truth claims, okay? So people who work in this game understand all this, okay? And so what we think, and we've theorised this, Professor Gaber, the UK academic that I spoke to you about earlier, who wrote the original kind of analysis of spin in the 80s. I've been working with him, and we've called it strategic lying. We had a paper published about this recently in the International Journal of Press Politics. And and we do see it as a form of spin that has evolved in the social media era, where it's an intentional lie based on all of these logics, okay? That they know it will spread faster, etc. It's an intentional lie. It's designed to capture the media attention and then hold it. So every time it comes up and you have to rebut it, then you're just reinforcing the claim all the time. Okay, it's spread through social media. It's amplified by the mainstream media. It keeps it alive. It's very hard to scrutinise, very hard to debunk. I mean, fact checking really isn't very effective. And so it just keeps spreading, and the repetition through rebuttal just keeps reinforcing the claim in people's minds. And some classic examples of that we've seen in the Brexit campaign, the claim around the £350 million a week to stay in the EU, which was proven to be false but didn't matter, and he just kept saying it, kept being rebutted. It didn't matter, and it was very effective. It really stuck in people's minds. In fact, the architect of that, his name escapes me at the moment, but he wrote on his blog about what a successful ploy this was, that had been such a successful campaign. In Trump, in the US, the election steal, it's a classic, it's a total lie. It's been proven to be untrue, but he just keeps going. And every time it's mentioned, it's rebutted and just keeps going. It's just got this, it's life of its own. The birther controversy, similarly, it was proven to be untrue, kept going. Just to keep going, that otherness that raised the doubt about Obama. In Australia, we've had some examples of it. One was called Mediscare, about, the Labor was saying that the Coalition was going to privatise Medicare. Following election, the Coalition was saying that Labor was going to introduce a death tax. I mean, it's just rubbish. Most recently, the government's been accusing or saying that the ALP is under China's influence and they've got Manchurian candidates in the Labor Party. So this stuff is happening a lot and increasingly, and it's a real shift, but it's along this kind of continuum, and it's happening because of these changes in media technologies, the way that audiences work, the affordances of media technologies, etc.
You can show us your other slide. I know that we.
So the other one I wanted. Sorry, this is just the other one that is particularly, there's lots of them, but this one I think is really important. About authenticity, like this is particular to social media, so again, it's a new logic because mass media was so staged, packaged news packages, 10-second grabs, stand up, all the rest of it. That doesn't work on social media. It's terrible, no one relates to it. Authenticity is the key thing, on social media to fly. Instagram's full of photos of, politicians, shaving or walking their dog, or, behind the scenes stuff. But it's cynical, it's a tactic in itself. So it's kind of a feigned authenticity. There's a Norwegian scholar called Gunn Enli, and she calls it mediated authenticity. And so it's a tactic in itself. I mean, and I don't know if you ever saw this, but I saw it and I thought it was terrible. It was BuzzFeed, Obama doing all this rubbish, taking selfies and playing basketball and spilling coffee and bleh. Anyway, it was just awful. It didn't work at all. When it works, it does work. When it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. The other one I put up here is Jens Stoltenberg when he was Prime Minister of Norway. This is really interesting. He spent a day in a cab driving around being a cab driver, and he had a dash cam. And people got in and out of the cab, and then they go, "Oh, you're Prime Minister," and "Oh my gosh, this is amazing." And people thought it was great that he spent the day in the cab, being an everyday person, people asking him questions about all sorts of stuff. And it seemed really real, it felt very authentic. And people praised him for it, for getting out there. And then it was revealed, that in fact, several of the people who got to the cab and asked questions were members of the party, and that was staged. There were some more authentic punters in the cab, but there were many that weren't. And it was terrible. And it was just there was real, people were upset about it. The audience was upset, the public were upset, because they thought, wow, we thought this guy was genuine. So, it's kind of this weird, authenticity is really important on social media, but it's contrived. It is a tactic. It's a form of, social media spin. Mm-hmm. So they're the two kind of social media ones that I wanted to just mention.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll get rid of the slides now if you like, and we can just talk.
Any other questions for Dr. Fisher? Matt?
What do you think in this new logic that you're describing, traditional media organizations can do to adapt, or do you believe that they can adapt to the new logic of social media and the new media environment that we're in? And then,
well, you all are. You're all doing it. I mean, I'm assuming, does your news organisation do stories for TikTok? Do they do them for, they do them? Yeah, well, you're doing it.
Trying.
Everyone's doing it. And the fact that you're doing it, you'd be crazy not to do it. It's like, we think it's terrible that they, so politicians put out memes and stuff. Why? Because they're shareable. Just like you're putting out stories that are shareable. If you don't, you're mad, because that's where the audience is. I mean, everyone's doing it. Everyone's adapting to these new logics.
Totally. And I guess then my second question would be, how in this new environment, assuming that we do still have some ability to craft narrative and or get people information, how do you believe politicians see media outlets? And that can be by the size of their audiences, the type of medium that they now work in, perceived ideological sympathy. Like, how do politicians think about that when they're leaking information or trying to spin people?
Yeah, everything. It's everything. There's no two media organisations are the same, and that's part of your job. If you worked in public relations and you were trying to sell a product, Coca-Cola or toothpaste, or superannuation, there's no point in trying to advertise superannuation on a youth radio station. No one's going to be interested. Or retirement. Similarly, low cut jeans, you're not going to sell, advertise that on a radio station that has an audience of 80 plus. So, audience is everything. You've got to understand your audience. And as a news organisation, you understand your audience. It's the same, you know who your readers are. You know what their political leaning is. You know what the age group is. The advertisers in your news outlet have the same. So everyone's taking those considerations into account. It's everything. And if you've got something, let's say you want to announce a new policy of some kind, well, you're not going to, and you're not going to give it to a news media outlet that is aggressive and opposed to you, that doesn't share or isn't a fair, a politically fair organisation. So I don't know, I'm assuming if Biden had some new policy, he's not going to give it to Fox, he's going to give it to someone, in the middle, or I don't know I don't know if he'd give it to the New York Times or someone on the left, I don't know. But, so yes, all of those considerations, you take all of that absolutely into account. There's no doubt about it.
When you're dealing with it, the question is, when you're dealing with the source, what's your advice for calling, if they're trying to spin you, what's your advice for calling out the spin without destroying that relationship?
think you just have to, it's a really good question. I think it's a negotiation, okay? So again, it comes down to these relationships, and it's a negotiation. So if they're not trying to give you any information or whatever, I think, or they're only giving you very little, I mean, sometimes it works in your favour. Sometimes it's, sometimes it works to your logic and your needs. Sometimes you're running on deadline and you only want 2 lines. And the fact that they only give you 2 lines suits you, actually. Like sometimes it's just convenient and you go, yay, thanks for just the neat 2 lines, okay? You're all laughing, understanding that. That's good. Sometimes, so spin works in your favour a lot of the time. And it's part of the logic, they get it. They get that you're busy. Give them what they want, yeah? But if you're digging on something that's a bit more controversial, and they're not giving you what you want, I think I'd work with them and kind of say, look, I understand this is a, maybe an uncomfortable topic for you, look, and you just have to say, but, I promise I will treat it fairly. I will give you a fair right of reply. We're not publishing until tomorrow or whatever. Don't trap them. Don't trap them in a corner at 5 to 10 on Friday night and say, can I have a response, please? And it's like such bad practice, and everyone does it. No one's laughing at the moment, but you should be, because I'm sure you've all done it. And it's really poor. You're trapping people. And why would anyone give you any information when they know you're going to treat them like that? No. So I think you have to work with ethically and honestly and say, look, I get this is difficult. I've given you, you've got 2 days to get back to me. Please ring me if there are any questions. These are specific things that we'd like to know. Just be a human being and try and work with them as much as possible. It mightn't work the first time, but the next time you do it, it might work. I go, actually, they were quite good to deal with last time on a difficult issue. I think I'll deal with them again. Or a difficult issue comes up for them and they think, oh, actually, that person's quite good to deal with. They were at least fair. I think that's all. It is about the hard road of being ethical, not trapping people, giving them a fair right of reply, all of that basic journalism. Ethical practice.
Ashley, did you have something?
She just answered it.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, one last question real quick. I wonder if you could speak more about the lying, and you said that, you don't think fact-checking is very effective. Do you recommend, if you know that it's a lie, do you recommend ignoring it as much as possible? What's your...
No, you have to call it out.
Mm-hmm.
You must call it out. You must call it out at the lie. The thing is that the politician knows that that's not going to have much effect. And in fact, if it is a lie and it's a deliberate lie, they want it out there anyway. And the fact that you call it out, this is going to keep it going. But you have to call it out. You have to.
Is there?
You're wedged. The media is wedged on this. It's a real wedge. But it depends on how ridiculous it is. Okay, if it's a really serious lie that is, that's really going to cause division, it's really racist, or it's, it's damaging stuff, it has to be called out for what it is. And it won't change, even if it's fact-checked, it won't change the mind of a partisan person, okay? And that's who they're playing to. They're playing to their base, okay? So in a way, it doesn't matter. You're never going to change the mind of someone. There's that saying, they used to say it about, I think it was originated about Trump, but it was used in relation to him as well. I think we use it in our paper. It's like, he might be a liar, but he's my liar, Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so partisans don't care if it's a lie. They go, yeah, but he's lying on my behalf. He's lying for my cause, It's okay to lie sometimes because we're the better side. So that's, partisans are never going to be changed. People in the middle who are unsure, it's really important that the lie is called out for them. And people on the other side, they don't believe a word they say anyway. So, it's this little middle ground, which I think there's probably not a lot of in America. We have a lot of middle ground in Australia. So it is very important, I think, to call that stuff out. Yeah, it's a really hard one. But, you know, one of the, yeah.
Well, hang on to them.
Yeah. Sorry.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fisher. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise from both sides. It's been very interesting.
Okay. Well, I hope it wasn't offensive, but it is good to understand how the other side works. And I recommend to any of you, if you want to go and have a stint on the other side, it'll make you a better political journalist. You'll really understand how it works.